wasn't supposed to hear it. That's the thing about accidents. They don't consult your schedule. It was a Tuesday, February. The particular kind of February that Kensington Palace does well gray pressing against every window, the heating doing its philosophical best, the corridors smelling of old carpet and fresh flowers in a combination that shouldn't work and somehow always does. William was walking back from a meeting that had run long, his security detail a half-beat behind him, his mind already 3 meetings ahead, when he turned the corner toward the east staircase and nearly walked into 2 junior members of the household staff. They didn't see him. That was the first thing. Not because he'd hidden, not because he'd tried, simply because they were mid-sentence, facing each other, and the human brain at full conversational velocity does not scan doorways for royalty. The brain assumes royalty will announce itself. The brain has been trained over many interactions, over many small protocols and advanced notices and footmen who appear before appearances, to expect a kind of atmospheric warning before a Prince of Wales walks into a room. There was no atmospheric warning. There was just William standing in a doorway, holding a folder of briefing notes, listening. The woman Hannah, he would later remember, 24, 3 months in the role, Scottish, wore her lanyard slightly too long, was saying, "He just seems tired, not in a bad way, in the way you are when you've been trying very hard for a very long time and you can't quite remember who told you to start." The man with her, Marcus, older, logistics, the kind of palace staffer who'd outlasted 3 private secretaries through sheer competence and discretion, nodded slowly, said nothing for a moment. Then, "He's working it out. You can see it. That's not a bad thing to be doing at his age." Then Hannah looked up. She saw him. The sequence of expressions that crossed her face in the following 2 seconds was one of the more honest things William had witnessed in recent memory. First, the freeze. Then, the calculation. Then, the particular English upper body movement that isn't quite a bow and isn't quite a flinch but lives somewhere between them, in the territory of people who know the protocol but have just been caught speaking as humans. "Sir, I'm so sorry I didn't." "No," William said. And then, because he wasn't sure what else to do, and because the folder in his hand suddenly felt very heavy, and because something about what Hannah had just said was still sitting in him like a stone dropped in still water, the ripples still moving, the stone not yet at the bottom, he said, "Don't be." He walked on. He thought about it for the rest of the day. Tired, not in a bad way, in the way you are when you've been trying very hard for a very long time. He turned it over, the way you turn something over that you're not sure is an insult or a gift, and you need more light before you can decide. He read his briefing notes. He sat through 2 calls. He had dinner with Catherine and listened properly and was present and good, and then he lay in the dark afterward and thought, when did someone last say a true thing about me without needing something in return? He couldn't place it. That was the second thing. He didn't decide to do it consciously. That's what he'd tell himself later, and it was partially true the way partially true things often are, true enough to repeat, not quite true enough to entirely believe. What happened was smaller than a decision. It was a habit forming in the place where a habit had never been. He started arriving to rooms slightly before he was expected. He started leaving them slightly after the formality had dissolved. He started, and this is the part that would have horrified his private secretary had his private secretary been aware of it. Standing just outside doors he had every right to walk through, for 30 seconds, sometimes a minute, listening to the quality of the room before he entered it. He told himself it was curiosity. That was true. He told himself it was research. That was also true. He didn't yet tell himself what it actually was, which was this. He had been described accurately by a 24-year-old woman in a corridor, a woman with no incentive to be accurate and every incentive to be flattering, and the accuracy of it had felt like cold water on a burn. Not pleasant exactly, but relief, the specific relief of contact with something real. He wanted more of it. The palace, he discovered, is extraordinarily articulate when it believes itself unobserved. There was the morning he stood for 90 seconds outside the equerry's office and heard his upcoming schedule described as optimistic, bless him, by someone on the phone. There was the afternoon he lingered near the kitchens and heard a woman explain to a colleague that she'd seen him once carry his own plate to the counter after a working lunch, and she'd nearly fainted, not from reverence but from surprise. Like seeing a golden retriever do differential equations, she'd said. Delightful, unsettling. He'd laughed, alone in a corridor, silently, because the laugh surprised him, and silent laughs are the most real ones. There was the staffer, he never got a name, who said to someone on the phone, "He cares. That's the thing people miss. They're looking for the statesman, and the statesman is there. But underneath it, there's just a man who cares rather a lot and has to be careful how much of that he shows, because every time he shows it, someone writes a headline about it." William stood with his back against the wall. The stone dropped. The ripples moved. He thought, is that what I look like from outside? A man managing the temperature of his own caring. He thought, yes, probably, yes. He didn't do anything with this information immediately. You don't, when information is that structural. You carry it. You walk around with it in your chest for a few days and test the weight of it. You wait to see if it changes shape. It didn't change shape. It just got heavier and somehow easier to carry at the same time, which is the specific paradox of true things. They're almost always heavier than the comfortable lies they displace. And almost always, once you're used to the weight, you find you walk better for it. He started thinking of it as an experiment. He told Catherine, eventually, in bed one night, speaking quietly in the particular tone they used for things that weren't for the public record of their relationship. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "And what are you hopping to find?" He said, "I'm not sure, myself maybe, the version that exists when I'm not in the room." She turned over, settled. Said, "What if you don't like him?" "Then at least I'll know," William said. "That seems better." She made a sound that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite disagreement. It was the sound of someone who loves you and is watching you do something slightly reckless and has decided to trust you anyway. He thought that sound was probably one of the finest things anyone had ever given him. The pub was called the King's Head, which struck him, when he noticed the sign, as the kind of irony that the universe deploys specifically to make a point. He'd come with a small security detail and the deliberate casualness of a man who has spent 30 years practicing looking like he hasn't thought about his appearance. Jeans, a wax jacket with actual mud on it, not decorative mud, real mud from that morning. Boots that belonged to the category of footwear that had been expensive once and was now simply present in the world in the way that things that have been used properly and long enough eventually are. Norfolk knows how to not see people. This is a specific local skill, as refined and particular as any craft tradition. The village near Sandringham had been adjacent to royalty for long enough that the locals had developed a sophisticated protocol of deliberate non-recognition. They saw you. They always saw you. But the acknowledged seeing was considered a kind of trespass, and so they looked slightly past you in a way that was warm rather than cold, inclusive rather than excluding, a silent agreement that said, "You can be a person here if you'd like to try." William had always been quietly grateful for this. He ordered a pint, sat at the bar, made small talk with the barman, Phil, mid-50s, the kind of competent stillness that good barmen carry, about the weather which had turned, and about the flooding in the lower fields which had not turned. Normal conversation, the specific texture of normal conversation, which William had learned to locate and hold onto the way you hold onto a railing in the dark. He stayed for 40 minutes. Then he went outside. He told his security he needed air. He stood on the gravel car park in the cold, which was a real cold, a Norfolk cold that came in off the flat fields with no manners and no apology. and the pub door, not fully latched, swung slightly open on its hinge. He heard himself. Not his voice, the idea of him, the William that existed in the conversational air of a Norfolk pub on a February evening among people who had no stake in the matter. There was a woman, he placed her voice at the corner table from earlier gray hair, had been with a man who looked like her husband, 2 glasses of wine in saying. He looked well, I thought, better than the photographs. Photographs always make them look either too grand or too tired. Her husband, he's got his mother's way of standing. Did you notice? Like he's listening even when he's not yet heard anything. A pause. Then the woman again, quieter, the way people go quieter when they're saying the thing they actually mean. She'd have been proud of him, whatever they say. Silence. The husband, yes, I think she would. William stood in the car park. The cold came in off the fields. He was not, and this is important, this is the specific important distinction, he was not crying. He was doing the thing that happens before crying in men who have spent their lives learning to reroute that particular river. A tightening, a stillness, the specific quality of attention you pay to your own breathing when breathing requires attention. His mother, always his mother, in the gaps, in the pauses people left, in the space between what people said to him and what they said when he wasn't there to receive it. She'd have been proud of him. He'd heard this before, in speeches, in letters, in well-meaning formalities that had worn the word smooth through repetition, until they meant slightly less than they should have. This was different. This was a woman in a pub in Norfolk with no one to perform for, saying it to her husband, in the voice people use when they're saying something privately true. He stood in the cold for a long time. Phil the barman came out eventually, ostensibly to put something in the bin, a thin pretext that William noted and was grateful for, and stood alongside him for a moment. Said nothing for a bit. Then nasty cold. Yes, William said. Another one. Please, William said. They went back inside. Nobody made anything of it. This was, he thought, exactly as it should be. The gala was for mental health. His. Well, not his specifically. The cause. The great spreading, stubborn, slowly shifting conversation about mental health in Britain that he had put his name to and his weight behind and his most carefully chosen public words into over years, in the particular way that public figures put themselves into causes they hold privately and specifically, and with more urgency than the polished speeches ever quite carry. The venue was a converted warehouse in East London, exposed brick, carefully considered lighting, the particular aesthetic of modern philanthropy, which has learned that visible luxury alienates donors, and that the simulation of austerity, done with sufficient craft, communicates both taste and seriousness simultaneously. He'd given the speech. It had gone well. The kind of well that is measurable in the room's breathing, 200 people leaning slightly forward, a specific quality of attention that is different from politeness and different from celebrity interest, and sits in the territory of people who are moved and are comfortable showing it. He'd shaken hands. He'd listened. He was good at the listening, and he knew he was good at it, and he'd made his peace with knowing he was good at it, which had taken longer than it should have. Then there was a break before the dinner portion, and he'd asked to use a back corridor to make a call, and his protection officer had swept it and cleared it and gestured him through, and the door had closed and he'd made his call, and then lingered a moment longer than he needed to, reading the texts he'd been ignoring, standing under a strip light in a service corridor between 2 large catering trolleys. He heard the door at the far end open. 2 voices, coming closer, then stopping. There must have been a counter, he'd think later, a table, somewhere to put down glasses, no more than 15 feet from him, with 2 catering trolleys between them and the dim light and the general ambient noise of the event providing whatever privacy they'd assumed they had. He recognized both voices. James, 43, had worked with him for 6 years in a senior communications capacity. The kind of professional who wore their loyalty like a well-cut suit, visible, fitting, not something you could grab onto because it lay so smoothly. Sharp, occasionally exhausting. The person William would call at 11 p.m. with a problem and expect an answer from by 11:15. And Rosie, charity sector, had known William through work for 4 years. Sharp in a different register, less polished, more instinctive. The kind of sharp that doesn't need to announce itself. They didn't know he was there. Of course they didn't. He thought very briefly about announcing himself. Then didn't. James was saying, "The speech tonight, I mean. When he's good, he's extraordinary. People forget. They argue about all the other things and they forget that he can walk into a room of 200 people who are professionally skeptical and make them feel personally seen." Rosie, he means it. That's the difference. It's not performance. You can tell the difference after a while. With him, you're watching someone say something they'd say in an empty room. James, do you think he knows how good he is at it? A pause. Rosie, no. And I think that's actually the thing. I think if he knew, if he really owned it, it would start to be performance. The not knowing is part of what makes it work. William stood very still. The catering trolleys were stainless steel. He could see a faint, warped version of himself in the nearest one. Stretched, distorted, the proportions wrong in the way of funhouse mirrors. Still recognizably him. James, he carries a lot. More than he shows. Rosie, quieter, yes. James, I sometimes wonder, and I'd never say this to him, I sometimes wonder if he knows how much the people around him actually, not admire, that's the wrong word, admire is too easy, rely on him. On the fact of him. On the fact that he's there and he's trying and he gives a damn. Rosie, maybe don't say it to him. James, why? Rosie, because then it becomes his problem to manage. Right now it's just true. Let it be true without him having to do anything about it. A silence. Then the sound of them moving, picking up glasses, the door at the far end opening and the noise of the gala flooding briefly in, and then being cut off again. William stood in the service corridor under the strip light for a long moment. He looked at the distorted version of himself in the catering trolley. The man in the steel looked back, warped at the edges, recognizable at the center. He thought, rely on him, on the fact of him, not the performance, not the title, the fact. He thought about what Rosie had said, let it be true without him having to do anything about it, and something in that landed with a weight he hadn't expected. He had spent so much of his life converting truth into action, receiving information and immediately asking, what am I supposed to do with this? How do I carry it correctly? What does this require of me? What if some truths were just for receiving? What if the appropriate response to being told by two people who had no reason to flatter an empty corridor that you were genuinely doing something worthwhile? What if the response was simply to stand there and let it be true? He straightened his jacket. He went back to the dinner. He was, Catherine would tell him later, particularly good at the table that night. Present, warm, laughing at the right moments and quiet at the right moments and asking questions that made people feel that the answers actually mattered. She didn't know why. He didn't explain. Some things you carry privately, not because they're shameful, because they're yours. He stopped thinking of it as an experiment somewhere around the 3rd week of March. Experiments have hypotheses. Experiments have conclusions. What he had was something softer and less definitive, a growing collection of data points that didn't prove anything and yet somehow added up to something. A portrait painted from the wrong direction, not from the subject outward as portraits usually go, from the observers inward, from the periphery toward the center. He kept the pieces separately at first, the way you keep evidence before you've decided what it's evidence of. Hannah in the corridor, tired not in a bad way. The woman in the Norfolk pub, she'd have been proud. James and Rosie in the service corridor, the fact of him, let it be true. Phil the barman, who had come outside in the cold for no reason at all, and had said nasty cold with the specific tone of someone who was saying, "I see you." Here is the particular dignity of being seen without being made to perform it. He thought about the difference between the William in the official photographs, composed, calibrated, carrying the weight of the role in his shoulders and around his eyes in ways he could see now when he looked at them. The specific tension of a man who has been performing readiness for long enough that readiness has become a mask he forgets he's wearing, and the William that was being described in these unguarded moments. They weren't different men. That was the thing he kept returning to. He'd half expected them to be. He'd half expected the overheard conversations to reveal a gap. The way investigations reveal gaps, the way scandals reveal gaps between the public performance and the private perception. He'd been prepared, in some part of himself he hadn't fully examined, for the private perception to be worse than the public performance. It wasn't worse. It was more. It was the same man with the calibration removed. The same qualities, the care, the trying, the particular quality of attention, but seen without the frame of protocol around them. Seen in the rough, unedited. The way you look in a photograph taken when you didn't know someone was looking and you think, "Oh, that's actually me. That's what I look like when I'm just a person." He sat with Catherine one evening in Kensington. The children were in bed. The house was in that particular quiet it achieves after children have been in bed for exactly long enough to be trusted to stay there. Wine, the lamp on the side table, the reliable ordinariness of a Tuesday evening in a marriage that had lasted because both people in it had chosen daily to make it last. He told her all of it. The corridor, Norfolk, the gala backroom, Phil and his nasty cold. He told it in order, which is how he processes things linearly, carefully, the way you debrief yourself when you want to be honest about the sequence of events and not just the conclusion. She listened. She didn't interrupt. This was one of her great qualities, the specific discipline of letting someone finish before she responded, which sounds like a small thing and is, in practice, a profound form of respect. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Does it change anything?" He thought about it properly, not the quick answer, the real one. "Not what I do," he said, "but maybe why. Maybe the why is clearer." She nodded slowly. "I think," she said carefully, "that you've been waiting for permission, not from anyone else, from yourself, to be enough. As you are, right now. Not when you've earned it more, not when the role is larger, now." He looked at her. She looked back. This was, he thought, the thing about being known by someone who has chosen to know you. Not the glamour of it, the specific, unglamorous, daily precision of it. The way someone who loves you can hear a story about strangers in corridors and identify, in 3 sentences, the thing it took you 3 weeks to circle. "Hannah said I looked tired," he said. "Not in a bad way. In the way you are when you've been trying very hard for a long time." She was right, Catherine said, not unkindly, as a fact. "I know," William said. "You can put some of it down," she said. "Not the duty, not the caring, but the performance of the caring. You can let the caring just be the caring." He thought about Rosie in the service corridor. Let it be true without him having to do anything about it. 2 women, different context. Different relationships, same sentence essentially, same instruction. Sometimes the universe needs to say a thing twice before it lands. This had needed to be said in a Norfolk pub and a London corridor and a service hallway and a Tuesday evening living room before he was ready to receive it without converting it immediately into a task. He was ready now. He thought about his father, who had been trying in his particular and often bewildering way to tell him something similar for years, that the doing was fine, the doing was good, but underneath the doing there needed to be a self that was not constituted entirely by the doing, that the monarchy could absorb a man completely if the man allowed it. That the ones who lasted, who did the role without being eaten by it, were the ones who kept something in reserve, not selfishness, architecture. Interior rooms the role didn't have keys to. He thought about his grandmother. 70 years. 70 years of this specific discipline. The management of the gap between the public self and the private one. The daily choice to give the public self generously and fully while keeping the private one intact and unperformed and simply, quietly, irreducibly hers. He had watched her do it his entire life without understanding the craft of it. He thought he understood it better now. Not from the briefings, not from the official guidance, from Hannah and Phil and a woman in a Norfolk pub whose name he didn't know, who had said she'd have been proud to her husband on a February evening with no audience and no agenda and nothing to gain. Truth donated freely is worth more than truth extracted carefully. He thought I should remember that. He thought I should remember all of it. He thought the man they're describing, the one who's tired not in a bad way, the one whose fact they rely on, the one who listens even before he's heard anything. I want to be worthy of that man. Not by trying harder, by trying differently, by allowing, sometimes, the caring to precede the performance of the caring, by walking into rooms not just as the person who has prepared the correct response, but as the person who is genuinely, structurally, constitutionally interested in what is happening in those rooms before he arrives. By being, as much as possible, the same man in the corridor as on the dais, the same man overheard as addressed. This, he thought, was perhaps the longest education available to a person in his position. Not the protocol, not the constitutional theory, not the history or the ceremony or the accumulated weight of the institution pressing down on a life from birth. The education of learning to be the same person in all the rooms, including the ones you haven't entered yet, including the ones where people will describe you after you've left to someone who loves them, including the ones where no one is watching, especially those